Hi everybody, I'm coming to you from my kitchen today because I was cleaning some of it, and today we might have to cut it short. Unfortunately, I have people that are going to be staying over. They don't know me. They're actually guests of somebody else here, so I'm not going to be making videos when they're around. So there's an issue that's been getting hot in the news. It's about these Confederate monuments in the South. And there's been a lot of back and forth hatred going around. And I'm going to cover this topic from an angle where I can see where the momentum is going to be delivered soon. And the people that are in favor of removing the monuments have no idea what they're dealing with. They're basically setting themselves up to be shot in the foot repeatedly for basically a symbolic gesture that doesn't help anybody. In fact, it's a waste of time. It's a waste of money because ultimately the city of New Orleans, which is where this is happening, had to pay city workers overtime to remove these statues in the middle of the night. And it really serves the purposes of a certain sector of the Louisiana political spectrum that I feel are going to get themselves in a lot of hot water. A lot of them are digging their own graves politically. So let's go into it. The Washington Post, which lately they've been supplying a fair deal of fake news, and there's really nothing else to call it now. And it's a disgrace that's the word we have to use. But they have been putting out turd after turd after turd in terms of articles about any number of topics. It doesn't matter what it is. A lot of them have to do with Donald Trump. In this case, it doesn't really have to do with Donald Trump. So it says they were not patriots. New Orleans removes monument to Confederate General Robert E. Lee by Janelle Ross. By her name, I'm assuming she was not of Confederate heritage, at least not on the up and up legitimate marriage side. Okay? And no offense to her, obviously, I don't begrudge this of anybody that has, ancestors that lived under the Confederacy. But, her point of view, it might be true to herself, but it's not going to be true to the people that live in New Orleans area, at least. A lot of people are not going to take kindly to this and haven't already. She says they're all gone now. On Friday, the statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee became the last of New Orleans' 4 contested monuments to go, an end to more than 130 years of publicly honoring a man who embodied Southern pride and racial oppression. The monument sat at the entrance to the city's largest park, on a vaunted greenway, in a major traffic circle, and in one of the city's squares. They occupied places where you won't find many tourists meandering with long-necked frozen cocktails. Mayor Mitch Landrieu marked the historic moment with a rousing speech that sought to end nearly 2 years of heated debate in the city over what the monument said about its past. They are not just innocent remembrances of a benign history. These monuments celebrate a fictional, sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement, ignoring the terror that it actually stood for, Landrieu said, adding that Lee and the Confederate Army fought against the United States. They may have been warriors, but in this case they were not patriots. Since April, the monument's fates have drawn the national spotlight, prompting 24-hour vigils populated by people who call the structures emblems of Southern history and honor or landscape-defining art. Some came with guns on display, strings of ammunition strung across their bodies. Others, during an ultimately nonviolent face-off with activists determined to see the statues down, limited themselves to flak jackets and riot gear. A contractor involved in the removal work pulled out of the job after an arsonist set his $200,000 Lamborghini ablaze. So there's a question already. Why are they contracting people that obviously... This guy, $200,000 Lamborghini... Okay, that was a false alarm, and it looks like I didn't hit the pause button, so there's going to be an edit. Besides the point. As the Battle of New Orleans wanes, conflicts over rebel monuments, memorabilia, and merchandise are rising across the country in areas as far-flung from the Confederacy as Massachusetts and Ohio. Historically, Confederate symbols have appeared at times of racial discord. Questions about what to do with rebel symbols in public spaces, where they can be barred or removed, and what they mean have themselves become a source of conflict. The Southern Poverty Law Center counts at least 60 Confederate symbols removed or renamed in the 2 years since a white supremacist murdered 9 black parishioners in a Charleston, South Carolina church. Last week, a Boston-born, self-described white nationalist, Richard Spencer, led a nighttime gathering of white people clenching tiki torches in front of the Lee statue in Charlottesville, Virginia, a scene that that city's mayor called reminiscent of the Ku Klux Klan. So let's scroll down here. But Carol Anderson, a historian and professor of African American Studies at Emory University, says that the various reasons given for defending Confederate monuments and symbols share a common underlying expectation that even in an increasingly diverse democracy, power and influence should remain unchanged. Beneath all the talk is a longing for an America that is not only predominantly white, but where the resources of a very, very rich nation are funneled almost exclusively towards whites, said Anderson, author of the 2016 book White Rage. These are people who believe that they are actually oppressed and disadvantaged whenever anyone else's voice is heard, their needs addressed, and their political will prevails. So then it shows these, like, you know, this guy, like this shrunken old dude who's, yeah, this guy looks really privileged to me. He basically looks like a guy that I'd buy fishing bait from. And then it goes and talks to a bunch of these war reenactors and Confederate supporters and whatever. For Nick Glover, a 66-year-old Vietnam veteran, removing Lee's statue and the 3 other Confederate monuments from the New Orleans landscape amounts to an official act to dishonor men of valor. Glover, who is white, says 2 of his ancestors fought for the Confederacy at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. As he sees it, the men the monuments honor defended liberty. However, conversations about the denial of freedom for most blacks in the past should be avoided in the present, he said. This right here is a history that's got to be honored and preserved, Glover said, standing near a statue of Confederate General Pierre Gunter Beauregard, which the city removed Wednesday. I think we ought to be able to celebrate that without all the talk about white supremacy and slavery. So I'm not gonna read this whole article. The Washington Post really they beat a dead horse with this, okay? And you know, and I'm gonna have to edit this video a lot because of obviously having to step away for a second. But you know, there's a real issue here where the Democrats and the liberals and the people who want to redefine culture are simultaneously claiming that they're on the side of the poor and the downtrodden and whatever, and at the same time, you know, they're actually telling them that their own heritage is a heritage of shame, that it's a heritage of oppression, it's a heritage of hatred. That's what they're doing. And look, I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm a second generation American. Both of my parents immigrated here in the 70s and 80s. I don't have anybody in my family on either side who participated in the Civil War. Nobody owned slaves. I'm technically mixed race, Middle Eastern and white, Eastern European actually, and I'm Jewish. So why should I actually care about this topic? Well, you know, somebody who was actually conservative, who broke with the conservative logic, was talking about this week. He said, or last week, he started talking about it. He said, you know, those great American patriots defending the Confederacy should know that they're defending an entity that was in open rebellion and betrayed the United States. So why should we have their monuments up? And my response was very simple. We have to the north a country called Canada. In 1760, the Canadians, they had the battle that defined their identity. I think it was in 1760 or 1759. It's the Battle of Quebec. I'll bring it up. Okay, this was fought on September 13th, 1759 by the British Army and Navy against the French Army on a plateau just outside the walls of Quebec City. And what this battle did, it redefined the identity of Canada as a whole. But in part, Canada did not change. And what happened was that the Canadian forces under Louis Joseph de Montcalm, those French forces were defeated. The French side effectively lost Canada. They had to, their cause was lost afterward. The war was basically over. And yet there are still monuments to Montcalm, okay? Let me pull it up. I had it last week. Here it is, the Wolfe Montcalm Monument. Honored both sides. You know, it didn't honor just the British side. It didn't honor just the French side. So this argument that we're honoring the losers or the people that were in open treason against the government, you know, they're kind of flimsy, okay? You can put a monument up for whoever you want. It's really up to the residents and locals that make up that community, in my mind, okay? There's people that put up monuments nowadays. Look, there's people who put up monuments in New York to Puerto Rican nationalists, okay? And I believe Puerto Rico should leave the Union. I don't think that Puerto Rico needs to be part of the United States. I think that the people that are keeping it in are Puerto Ricans and federal government advocates, okay? So we have to move past this notion that, you know, might is right and the history is defined by the winner. Sure, yeah, that's true. That's true. That does not mean that monuments to people that were on the losing side of a conflict or could be considered, you know, rebel traitors because their side lost. But, well, what about the William Wallace Monument in Scotland? Okay? All of you have seen Braveheart, right? Let me pull that one up. The National Wallace Monument, generally known as the Wallace Monument, is a tower standing on the summit of Abbey Craig, a hilltop near Stirling in Scotland. It commemorates Sir William Wallace, a 13th century Scottish hero. And this is in a country that since probably the 1200s has been subjugated by the English. They've become part of the British Empire entirely. Scotland's closest lick at getting independence was, what was it, in 2014 or 2015 when they had a referendum and they voted against getting independence. So who are we kidding here? Are we going to start tearing down monuments to people that were part of losing movements in history? There are monuments to Napoleon. There are monuments to all sorts of people. Are we going to tear down the Palace of Versailles because the French monarchy was ousted in 1789? This movement is based on complete bullshit. People need to get a grip and solve the problems of people in the present. Now, this is dovetailing, unfortunately, with another movement that's being developed in the United States. The movement to redefine and to reach out to the middle class and the working class among Democrats. And what I want to say here is that sorry, I'm making noise here with the sugar. They're going to betray the very people that they're trying to attract, because the two-party political system will never, ever, ever fully embrace the values and interests of middle class and working class voters because they've already become corrupted enough and infiltrated enough by corporate interests, lobbyists from all over the world. You can take whatever side you want. You can attack who you want, because to some extent you would be right. Okay, I'm not telling you that these lobbyists are evil people. I'm just saying that they have undue influence. So what's going on today is that there is this liberal comedian. He calls himself the liberal redneck. His name is Trey Crowder. And while he still hedges his bet and says, you know, we have to preserve Southern culture and whatnot, and that the Southerners in the U.S. should be proud and should be allowed to take pride in them in their heritage, what he also does is he lays down effectively with racial arsonists. Okay, and I'm somebody, I believe that racial identity is a bunch of nonsense. You know, if you're a white nationalist, I have to believe that you're basically holding on to a sector of your identity that really doesn't have any relevance. There's no such thing as a white nation. because in reality, white people, they descend from all different types of people. You know, Celtic peoples, Slavic peoples, I already said Celtic, I almost said Gaelic, Scandinavians, you have Saxons, you have Latin peoples, you know, the southern Europeans, you know, the Greeks and the Romans, who are now the Italians, and you have Romanians, and you have all sorts of them. So what is the white race? Who the hell knows? You know, in the United States, we've also had a lot of mixed marriages with Indians, with black people, with Asian people. The white race is a fiction. There is something called white culture that, you know, I think is also very indistinct. You know, to say that there's a white culture today, a modern white culture, I think is really exaggerating. It's more like a cosmopolitan culture that's not even, it doesn't even have anything to do with white identity. It has more to do with class identity. And the redneck identity is contrary to that. So you've actually got a counterculture where people cling to their roots in the country, cling to their roots in a simpler time with more simple instruments. You'll never see rednecks and people living in the country embrace classical music because it's a culture that's foreign to them. They don't identify with Beethoven, and they don't identify with Bach. And I can relate to that. I actually relate to Southern culture a lot more than to traditional European culture. I think Richard Spencer, the person that they cited in this article, doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. He's kind of trying to forge an instrument out of two different metals, which is, you know, if you don't know, that's actually a bad idea because they galvanize and end up causing corrosion between each other. So, to move on, I'll talk to you about Trey Crowder, this liberal redneck. Hold on. So before I start this video, Trey Crowder actually went on with a certain creator who has a checkered past referring to white people. She's not exactly a huge fan of them, which kind of makes me think, you know, are you still representing the so-called white Southerners, or are you basically becoming some sort of stooge of people who basically hate them? So here we go.
Hey, Francesca, do you remember that time we were out and that totally random girl came up and just started touching your hair? And how annoying that was for you?
Actually, what I remember is that you interrupted me to explain why it was offensive.
Yeah. Oh, that was awesome.
I love that you want to speak up for me, but I don't really need you to explain racism for me. That's this thing called
whitesplaining. It's when a white person explains why something is offensive to a person of color. It's considered super condescending, babe.
Thanks, but again, you don't need to tell me
how she feels, Brad. Trying to give people of color permission for how they can or should feel is treating them like children. It's like when a man is...
Mansplaining? I'll take this one.
Stop. You all need to realize that
white people can't decide what is and what isn't racist.
Did you just come into our apartment just to correct me?
It's cool. I grew up in a diverse neighborhood, so I know your struggles.
I don't think that you do, and that's...
Really patronizing. She doesn't need you to tell her about her experience.
Who are you, and how did you get in here?
Don't mind me. I teach African American.
Anyway, this is the way that Francesca Ramsey, she has this show on MTV called MTV Decoded. It's basically garbage that's heaped on white people and on men, and especially straight men, and especially straight white men that are you know, successful or born into successful families or born into rich families, however you want to put it. And her whole point is to churn out so-called entertainment that's targeted at a certain group. Okay, so included in that, what they basically do is they portray the white underclass as ignorant fools that succumb to the fears that are cranked at them by, you know, the religious right or by these elitist politicians, you know, the rich, white, privileged, overclass, and that's about it. That's their only token nod to the black underclass. I mean, the white underclass. Okay, they will do this all the time. All they have to do is create a separate identity for rednecks and call them lower class, and then they put them in the hierarchy of oppression, and then they can count on their support. That's what they used to do, by the way, in the South during segregation. Okay, and now they're resegregating society. They're just, they're putting one side instead of putting the blacks on the bottom. Okay, which they are on the bottom, by the way. Most of black society, if you look statistically, or in concentrated areas, if you look in Baltimore, if you look in Ohio, if you look in Buffalo, they're living in relative poverty to the surrounding areas, by an egregious standard, health-wise, in terms of earnings, in terms of mobility, in terms of buying power. But where are they actually gaining the most traction? In the New South, in Atlanta, in Charlotte, in Florida. The New South is the new economic engine for black Americans. It used to be that black Americans who wanted to have, a successful life, they would leave the South. This was in the early 20th century. They had the Great Migration to Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan. They ended up working in the auto plants, in meatpacking plants in Chicago. That's how, think about it. Originally, the white population or the black population in the United States was mainly limited to the South. Okay. Another thing you have to understand, okay, before we go further, I forgot to mention it when we were talking about the monuments. The northern states in the Civil War were not free states. Okay, there were a number of them that were free states. Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, for example, Ohio, Indiana, those were all free states. They prohibited slavery at some point before 1860. There were a number of states that stayed in the Union, stayed loyal to the Union, that were slave states. Okay, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky. You had states out west and territories out west that were technically slave-owning areas until well into the war. Kansas, I believe, was a slave state because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So there has to be this. I hate using the word intellectual honesty, but there has to be a recognition, at least, that the Civil War was fought between two sides that had cynical motives in mind. The North wanted to preserve the integrity of the federal government, the integrity of a constitutional supremacy of the federal level above the state level. The South wanted to preserve slavery, but they also wanted to preserve the ability of states to object to federal laws. And among those laws was the emancipation of slaves. And you have to take into account, and this has to be recognized, that the emancipation of the slaves was made in a constitutional manner, but not perfectly. It was made during the war. It was made using a constitutional amendment. I think it was the 13th Amendment. I'm kind of showing a little illiteracy here, but they emancipated the slaves through a constitutional amendment. Okay, if anybody wants to see like major change go through today, they always talk about passing laws at the federal level, gun control. Jim Jeffries had this ridiculous rant on one of his comedy tours that comparing guns to slaves. Well, Jim Jeffries should know that if he wants to repeal the Second Amendment, it would require a constitutional amendment. So if he wants to, he can advocate for a constitutional amendment to repeal the Second Amendment. Okay, I've said this to a friend of mine too, who's always gung-ho. He's like, we can't just use the Second Amendment to justify everything. I said it doesn't matter. That's the way this system works. The constitutional system means that you need to amend the Constitution when you want to alter anything that's in the Bill of Rights. So, getting to Trey Crowder and his ridiculous partnership with Francesca Ramsey. This is somebody He's such a this is what undermines his credibility. You cannot, on the one hand, claim that you are out there as a redneck, a liberal redneck, to talk about the real interests of white Americans, white poor Americans, white Southern Americans, when you are actively collaborating with somebody who explicitly hates them. Okay? Explicitly. She doesn't even make a secret of it. She has no respect for them. She thinks their heritage is a bunch of oppression. And in fact, Trey Crowder made a video. I'll put a link to the video. I'm not going to show it. But he made a video where he basically objected to people that were against Southern heritage, including Confederate monuments and symbolism. But here's his video with Francesca last week.
Poor people. Lazy, right? Wrong. Today, we're going to debunk 5 common and super wrong myths about poverty in the U.S. Myth 1. Poor people are just lazy. If they worked harder, they wouldn't be poor. Sure, let's just generalize every poor person and blame them for the systemic and
Let me stop that right there. The real argument here is not that they should work harder. It's that sometimes you're in a job that it doesn't matter how hard you work, you're not going to get further. Okay, if you stay a short order cook for the rest of your life, you're not going to get much further. Okay, so she doesn't know what the hell she's talking about. The argument is brought to the most simplistic terms by her.
Institutional barriers that contribute to their poverty. Okay, let's bust this myth. The majority of Americans in poverty actually work 1 or more jobs, and nearly 6 million Americans currently working part-time jobs wish they had full-time jobs. Oh, and who caused the massive job losses of the Great Recession of 2008? Hint, hint, not poor people. Not to mention, since the 1970s, wages have basically stagnated.
Yes, it was not poor people. A lot of it was because of technology. And yes, the Great Recession was actually caused by who? Yes, it was caused by subprime loans that were extended by government loaning agencies, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, to poor people that could not afford these loans, called subprime mortgages. Okay, did I say that already? Subprime mortgages are mortgages to people with bad credit that were forced on these companies and lenders, these major banks like Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. They were forced on them, and they didn't exactly oppose it. They said, yeah, we'll make money off of these subprime loans. Eventually, we can dump it on somebody else. So Francesca Ramsey is blaming the rich people for a problem that the rich people were only one part of. The real problem was that the subprime loan crisis was created by the federal government. Okay?
While life has gotten much more expensive. Also, we should probably keep in mind that 35% of the poor who don't work are actually children, the elderly, and the disabled, people who often can't work. Sorry, little Susie, being 3 isn't an excuse.
Yes, but a lot of those people, for example, benefit from other poor people programs, not including welfare, such as WIC and federal disability and Social Security payments. So I don't know what she's trying to get at here. If your benefits are not able to bring you out of poverty, then exactly what purpose do they serve? And the more that you pour into these benefits, the more the taxation system is going to be harsh on the rest of the economy, and therefore the value of your money will mean less, and you're still going to have poverty.
Use. Myth 2. If poor people just laid off the booze and drugs, they wouldn't be poor. I'm gonna let my friend Trey handle this one.
Look, it's not like using drugs turns you poor. If that happened, then half of Hollywood would be living in a cardboard box. Drug and alcohol abuse is an issue for some poor.
So, actually, he ignores the fact that a lot of Hollywood people have had their lives and careers ruined by drugs and alcohol and have returned to poverty. First of all, a lot of them die from their abuse of drugs and alcohol. Look no further than Marilyn Monroe and Bon Scott and Scott Weiland, one of the greatest vocalists of the past 30 years, died from drug use. That's really an awful comparison to make by Trey Crowder, okay? And I'm not even going into the redneck issue, but look, yes, the abuse of drugs is not exclusive to poor people, but the effects on them are worse. Meth and crack, which are respectively the drugs of choice for poor communities in America, black and white poor communities in America, destroy families in those communities. So don't start telling me that poor people, just because they abuse drugs in lower percentages, that it's not more of a problem. The problem is that a poor family will be affected more adversely by a drug problem than a rich family because they're less capable of seeking rehab because they're poor and they can't afford it.
People, but it's not a major cause of poverty. In the past few years, several states, including my home state of Tennessee, have actually implemented a system of drug testing for welfare applicants exactly because of this stereotype. And guess what they found? Across the board, they found that applicants living at or below the poverty line actually have a lower rate of drug use than the population at large. Turns out drugs are expensive. Who knew? So it's not helping anybody.
So the issue is not whether they abuse drugs in larger quantities. The issue is if you're subsidizing drug habits by giving drug abusers welfare. Because a rich person can afford to indulge his drug habit, okay? And that's not for long, by the way. Once you enter the poor sector of the population, if you're a rich person and you're abusing opioids and you eventually screw yourself by using all your money for those opioids, you eventually leave the upper class and become part of the poor underclass. That's the way it works. It's once you spend your money, once you spend your way into indulging your habit to the point where you ruin your entire life, and you, for example, you can get a divorce because of it. You can lose your children because of it, lose custody of your children, end up paying child support. So what Trey Crowder is doing here is a lot of misdirection. Okay, we're basically taking the topic of class and drugs and making it seem like they're independent variables here. It doesn't work that way. The effect of drugs on an individual or a family is dramatically different based on somebody's economic status. Okay, a rich person can afford to seek rehab in a much better and timely manner than a poor person can. Okay, a poor person cannot afford often to seek drug counseling at a place like the Betty Ford Center. Okay, that's very rare. It's a fact.
It's a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. Hey, here's an idea. Maybe we should start drug testing the rich people who come up with these laws in the first place. Oh, wait, that's right. The Supreme Court has already ruled that it's literally unconstitutional to drug test members of Congress and applicants for political office, because that makes sense.
Myth 3. If poor people just studied harder and went to college, they'd be fine. Look, I'm all for working hard and going to college.
So what she just presented is actually not a Republican or a conservative viewpoint. In fact, the person I remember most who talked about this, that's just me, is Joe Biden. He said that college education is a gateway to the middle class, okay? And he's far from being a conservative. He's far from being a white supremacist. Joe Biden is about one of the most liberal members of Congress in the history of the Senate, or senators, sorry. And he was a very liberal vice president. So if she wants to make a whole video on how Joe Biden was talking out of his ass, I'll be waiting for it.
But education isn't a poverty cure-all. The biggest problem is that in this country, public schools are largely funded by local taxes, which means high-poverty districts have less money to spend per student than wealthier districts. 15.6% less, in fact. So poor neighborhoods have poorer schools, which means lower rates of success for poor students, making it much tougher to succeed. And let's not forget that the overall cost of college has increased $1,120.
So if that's the case, Francesca, maybe you should support school vouchers, which means that children could choose which school to go to, or their parents could. They could go to a Catholic school. They could go to a private school if they were able to get eligibility for it and get a scholarship. They could go to a charter school. Why not support that? Instead, you're talking about how poorer districts are going to have less money for schools. Well, that's intuitive, okay? We don't need you to explain that. Okay, so let's get back to here. I don't know why she's using Trey Crowder in order to make these points, which actually have more to do with inner city communities than they do with rural communities. Okay, rural communities, yes, they have awful public schools, but that's also because they're often remote and they have to combine resources between small communities. So what are they supposed to do?
8% since 1978, and a degree doesn't mean you'll be rolling in dough. Poor people face so many educational hurdles, saying college isn't really helpful. Thanks for trying, though. Myth 4. Most poor people are the blacks in the inner city.
Okay, no. Most poor people in the U.S. aren't black. Actually, most poor people in the U.S. look, and a lot of them sound, like me. I mean, it's true that the rate of poverty for black people in America is disproportionately higher, but the actual number of poor people, way more white people. Part of the reason the stereotype persists is because anytime poor people are presented in the media, it's usually poor black people in the cities. And this stereotype sucks for everybody. Black people are made out to be something that they're really not. And
okay, I can dispute that. Remember the shows Beverly Hillbillies? You remember the Waltons? Do you remember Little House on the Prairie? Have you seen the show Shameless? Have you seen the show, what's it called? Moonshiners. Yeah, there's so many shows. What about Here Comes Honey Boo Boo? Have you seen that one? How many shows do I have to talk about where they depict white poverty all the time? How about Sons of Anarchy? They're not exactly rolling in the dough. White poverty has never been out of the public eye. Okay? And to be fair, black poverty has also not been out of the public eye. What happens, you have, on the one hand, when you portray black poverty, people say, oh, this is negative and whatever. They'll talk about how, Good Times was racist and what's that show? The one with Bill Cosby's characters, Fat Albert and the Junkyard Gang, how they're racist and they depict blacks as poor and whatever. Well, when the pendulum swung to the other side and you had Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and the Cosby Show, then they were being accused of papering over the real problems of the black community. So you can't have it both ways. You can either embrace the stereotype of the ghetto, or you can talk about, other sectors. In the case of Cosby, a black doctor. So this to me is just a feature of the complaining class, as they should be called, where they can never be satisfied. Okay, you can't make them happy either way. Either you portray them as poor and they call you racist because you're making them look like uneducated ingrates, or you portray them as rich and they accuse you of being just misrepresenting the problems of the black community. And it's the same thing here. They claim, white poverty is not talked about. It's talked about plenty. Okay? It's talked about a lot. Breaking Bad, all about white poverty. Okay? Or the lack of options. There's plenty of shows. What about Fight Club? That guy wasn't rolling in dough.
And poor white people aren't cared about at all. Or the only time a camera ever shows up in places where I'm from is if they're there to film an episode of Cops.
So basically the media is racist and classist. What else is new? Myth 5. Being poor in America is better than being poor anywhere else. Okay, now try to follow along. Just because poverty is bad somewhere else doesn't mean being poor in America is good. There are 1.5 million American households living on less than $2 per person a day. That's below the global extreme poverty line. 13 million children in America live in households that lack the means to get enough nutritious food on a regular basis. And they live much shorter lives.
Guess what? Being poor just sucks, no matter where you live.
The important thing to remember here is that being poor is not a moral failing. It doesn't mean you're any less hardworking or any less deserving of reaching your dreams. And maybe the sooner we realize that, the sooner we can start finding better ways to pull people out of poverty. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time right here.
So, to sum up, this is a person who in the past has, basically waved off claims that white people suffer from poverty too, that they can be non-privileged or whatever. And she never went as far as saying that there's people who are born white and lack privilege. As Trey Crowder would probably say, he talked about how he grew up in crushing poverty and whatever. If he really wanted to make a video that would make an impact, he would have demanded of Francesca Ramsey to take back those statements. White privilege is literally a concept that is used to drive a wedge between different people, okay? It's the same as white power. At the root of it all, if you want to end racist culture as a whole in the United States, you're kind of chasing a windmill, okay? There's always going to be racial hatred, but the way to diminish it is to increase the ways that people can interact and have productive relationships. And one of the ways that those relationships can develop is to be in the same schools together, or to be going to the same extracurricular activities together, work in the same workplaces. That's the way this happens. If you have more interaction and have more of a cohesive atmosphere between different communities, and it doesn't even have to be just blacks and whites. This is usually talked about in terms of blacks and whites. That's the main focus of Francesca Ramsey. Once in a while, she'll throw in a video about Asians. She'll throw in a video about Mexicans. In fact, she made a Cinco de Mayo video where she accused non-Mexican Latinos of being racist if they celebrated Cinco de Mayo. So with her, there's no way to win. This is cultural Maoism. There's another creator on YouTube, Anthony Logan, who I'm happy he talks about it a lot. But what we're doing here is we're dividing people into racial and class groups in order to pit themselves against each other and form a society that is collectivist, okay? And even if it is collectivist, the collectives are divided among those categories. So, it's been, and I started out saying this, that I hope this will be a short video. It's not going to happen, obviously. We're at 43 minutes. But it was important to go through this. The removal of Confederate monuments and the destruction of Southern heritage, it's going to have a negative effect on liberal America. Okay, I'm not going to say whether I support Confederate heritage. I don't have any. It's not within me to decide which one is good or bad. But like I said about the example with the British in Quebec, and with the Scottish, the William Wallace Memorial, this idea that people who led rebellions or were on a losing side of a war don't deserve monuments is based on nothing, okay? It's just based on this idea that, well, they lost the war. Why should they ever get a monument? Well, that's really up to the local residents to decide, in my opinion. I don't care. This isn't about having them portrayed as the victors or as the noble people. Even though it might be in the eyes of the local people, it's about local people being able to decide how their heritage is depicted. Not elites somewhere else. Not people that have the interest of satisfying some sort of cultural pressure. And what this is going to do is going to crystallize and harden the base of far right-wing people. Okay, they're going to say, look, there's all these clubs. They're springing up on college campuses. They're talking about Latino pride, or as they're now calling it, Latinx pride, which is laughable if you know anything about Latin culture, about, Hispanic culture. They're going to say there's all those groups that are taking pride in their heritage, Asian heritage, for example, Chinese heritage, which, to be honest with you, I think that the Asian communities in their various, national categories, you know, the Koreans and the Filipinos and whatnot, those are the ones that are least obviously maintaining cultural separatism. The white people are going to object to being excluded from this pie of racial identity, and there's going to be a lot more bloodshed. The Democrats and the liberals are already banking on there being a resistance summer, and if they're banking on that, they're going to come to a rude awakening. I don't want people to end up suffering physically, you know, whatever repercussions there may be, because of these ridiculous stunts intended to oppose President Trump. Okay, but they're asking for it. Basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to goad white people in the South into a confrontation. And they already have. Okay, this Lamborghini was burnt. This is not the way that you mount an alternative. Listen to, you know what? I'll give you a suggestion. You should listen to progressive voices that are calling for a real comprehensive plan to reform the Democratic Party or to reform the progressive movement. They are talking about concrete programs for healthcare, for you know, educational benefits. You should, if you're going to oppose the conservative agenda, you should come with it. You should come with ideas. You should not come with confrontational nonsense that's not benefiting anybody. Because, like I said numerous times, I don't support any progressive agenda. I don't have any sympathy towards them, but at least they have a real agenda. The liberal agenda is bankrupt today. They have literally sold themselves to the devil in order to oppose Donald Trump, in order to oppose white communities, even though white communities don't really exist to a certain extent. There's very few communities that identify openly as white. You know, there's churches that are almost exclusively white. But to be fair, those churches are often based around certain ethnic groups within the white community, and therefore they're exclusionary in any case. So, you know, my suggestion would be to integrate the churches first, to integrate the other sectors of society that are segregated, and this focus on the Confederate monuments is going to benefit nobody. We have to create a society where people are judged on the merits of their work instead of on their appearance or on their heritage. Okay, that's the way we move towards a society that has less racial hatred in it. Anyway, that's it. I can go on forever about this. This is Ramon, Bold Like a Leopard. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, please subscribe. Please look at my other pages below. And let me know if you have an idea and if you want to debate one of these topics with me. Have a good day.